I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Representative Blumenauer. He is of Oregon, has focused on innovative transportation policy, which is why we're especially glad that he's with us today. After his election to Congress in 1996, he served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for 10 years before moving to Ways and Means to focus on transportation funding. He's introduced legislation to increase the federal gas tax for the first time in 23 years, and he helped pass a bill to fund state pilot projects that study replacing the gas tax with the mileage-based user fee, the congestion tax that Cliff was referring to. This was building on demonstrations in Oregon and California. He's helped pass the most recent 5-year surface transportation bill that provides modest funding increases for transportation projects. He's also the co-chair of the Intelligent Transportation Systems Caucus and is making sure that Congress encourages emerging smart mobility technologies as a way to create livable and equitable communities. He wrote a recent piece in Wired magazine, which I recommend to all of you, on the role of self-driving cars to help America's infrastructure. We look forward to, pardon me. I just want to thank him again for agreeing to share his thoughts today and remind everyone that my colleague Amy Liu will be interviewing him and taking questions from all of you after his talk. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Blumenauer.
Thanks, Ted. Well, I think your son may get a driver's license, but it'll be a choice, not an imperative, either socially, his choice. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, appreciate Brookings again being on the cutting edge of tying pieces together. And I find that little subjects that I get involved with you folks on have a tendency to metastasize. We were here debating whether, actually in this room, whether or not marijuana should continue to be a Schedule I controlled substance. And it morphed into Black Lives Matter, health care, the new economy, justice reform. And likewise, I think this conversation today has many profound aspects that tie together things that we've been working with you at Brookings on for years in terms of metropolitan policy, in terms of transportation and infrastructure, economic activities. What I'd like to do, if I could, just before kind of launching into what I think the federal government's role should be, I'd like to just set the context in terms of what I think is happening out there. Because I do believe that the change that has been talked about is going to be profound and it's going to happen much more rapidly than any of us think that it will. But at the same time, we are still going to be dependent on much of what the existing transportation infrastructure is. And it is currently inadequate and falling apart. So we're going to have to be on a dual track. But I think the good news is we have a chance to do that. Part of what is driving this goes beyond just simply congestion. People are awakening to the fact that we've got 250 million cars that are used 3, 4, 5, 6% of the time. It's an average cost that is approaching $10,000 a year per car. We have somewhere between 500 and 700 million parking spaces. I find it interesting, there really isn't a good census on the number of parking spaces. We're having challenges in communities that are attractive, that are drawing millennials who are well educated. That's a problem in Portland and Seattle. I mean, they're driving up housing costs, although it's a problem that is better than the problems of decay. But nonetheless, it is the realization from these people that there are more things involved. A critically expensive part of the housing crisis is the policies regarding parking. And that's $200-300 a month per apartment. It's $40,000 or $50,000 for a condo. Something like 20% of our houses in 2015 had 3 or more car garages. That's big money, and it distorts the market. We're looking at what I think is a more profound political crisis. I forget who it said that he didn't think anybody's going to lose their job over a few positions driving or not. Boy, that's not my message from this last campaign. There are 12 million people, probably more, whose livelihood depends on the manufacture, design, sales, care and feeding of the automobile, operating automobiles. 12 million. And probably the largest source of employment for men with less than a college degree is driving those vehicles. And that's going to be profoundly changed. So, looking at the big picture here, in terms of the volume of change that's involved, and Emily, I spent enough time in Detroit to know that it's hard to imagine living there without your own individual car. But that's in part because Detroit is probably the best example of a city that was destroyed by the automobile. Indiscriminate planning and design. They don't have a decent mass transit system. Voters turned, I mean, you look at an area that is designed to fail, to add those extra costs, to compromise the urban environment. And I would suggest that Detroit is Exhibit A. Although it's fun for me to watch what's going on there in Detroit. They're building a streetcar. There was an effort to have a transit system. There will be urban revitalization. And if we're able to have autonomous vehicles and more application of Uber and Lyft type technology, it will free people from the costs, the burdens, and the problems of individual automobile ownership. And in fact, you may be able to skip some of the transit or fixed route solutions and go to something that is more decentralized and works better. Kids today no longer are obsessed with a driver's license. It was a rite of passage for some of us boomer. We camped out at the DMV the night before we turned 16. Now, 16-year-olds are half as likely to have a license, and that they're more interested in access and experiences than being tethered to the ownership of a vehicle. They have better choices. Well, I think the way that the automobile destroyed metropolitan Detroit while it enriched it, I think we are on the verge of looking at ways to revitalize and reshape American communities that all, to a significant extent, were defined by the automobile century. But now there are other choices and opportunities. And I think it's going to affect where we live, move, work, the nature of the communities, the economy. It's not just in terms of the congestion issue and it's all of these pieces put together. We've got a chance to reorder priorities in the communities. We can be more purposeful in dealing with the transportation network and how it fits together, unlike the automobile age where we just sort of backed into it. There wasn't any comprehensive effort to think about how the pieces fit together. It was a series of incremental decisions that were easy at the time, driven by the love affair for the automobile, driven by the convenience, driven by the economic engine that it created. We've got a chance now to be more purposeful about it. And I would suggest we have to be more purposeful about it. Because if we don't do this right, there will be all sorts of unintended consequences in terms of having, remember I said we had to maintain both these systems. Well, if we don't do this right, we won't be able to maintain both those systems and pay for it. One of the things that we've not talked about to this point is how the bottom is about to fall out of the transportation funding system. Now, as was referenced, I've been trying for 20 years to raise the flipping gas tax. Something I will say that it's interesting that 8 red Republican states were able to do this calendar year, but I could never persuade our legislative leadership or the president to embrace. We'd be a lot better off if we had done some of that. But now it's no longer optional, because the 40% of the purchasing power of the Highway Trust Fund that has been lost due to changing driving patterns and to inflation is about to tank, because these autonomous vehicles will be electric. They're not going to be diesel or internal combustion engine. And they will use far less energy, and they will pay no gas tax. These autonomous vehicles are safer. And put aside for the moment that we're going to save 10, 20, 30,000 lives a year and hundreds of thousands of injuries or more, but we're not going to be having as many speeding fines. We're not going to be having as many parking fees. And they're not going to be paying fuel taxes. That's how we finance the system. And you look at how hard it has been at the federal level to fool around with trying to patch an inadequate transportation bill. It's going to get a lot worse a lot faster. That's going to force a reevaluation. The dozens of companies that are working on this now are in a race to be able to perfect this stuff. And the last couple years, as I've been visiting with people in various companies, technology, looking at manufacturing, trucks, boy, I am stunned at the revolutionary pace that is taking place and what the incremental improvements are possible. Daimler Trucks are headquartered, their American subsidiary, headquartered in my district. Talking to the CEO last week, talking about how it's going to be possible very soon to be able to have trucks travel in tandem with only one sort of at the wheel. This is stuff that can happen in a matter of months. The question, I guess, that I want to address is how we are going to deal with this in a policy perspective. Are we going to be able to welcome, guide, and manage the transition, or whether it's going to be driven offshore? I mean, I think Ford is testing in London now, autonomous vehicles. Do I have that right? As well. But this is not something that's here. There was a convoy of Volvo trucks going across Germany this spring. It's not just Otto, O-T-T-O, delivering beer in Colorado. I look at what happened with our inability to really manage the transition with drone technology. I mean, the FAA, it deals with 300,000 airplanes. How do you land a jumbo jet safely? Now they're tasked with dealing with drones, which is basically a smartphone that flies. And they're dealing with 300,000 planes, and they're going to be looking at almost 3 million drones, if not more, that are registered. And I don't know how many rogue drones will be out there. You know, for $1,000, you can order one from China, get it delivered by Amazon, not yet by a drone. We don't want to be in a situation where it just passes by. I also think that it is important to utilize this transition to be able to deal with the financing at the same time we deal with congestion pricing. There is a relatively small step between having a road user charge that is uniform and that is collected automatically for using your vehicle, which is Oregon's been testing this for the last 11 years. It's appropriate. The state that gave you the first gas tax dedicated to highway construction in 1919, at the century mark, will be able, I think, to be having a large-scale application of a road user charge. But it's going on in other states, and in the FAST Act, we have 4 years of additional pilot projects. There are 8 that are underway right now, financed by the federal government. This needs to employ, I think, sooner rather than later, congestion pricing. And it can be designed in a way that everybody benefits. What is right now, congestion is the largest driver of cost in our transportation system. That's where we throw most our highway dollars, is trying to deal with congestion. Being able to have a modest price for congestion will enable us to be able to incent consumer behavior so that they can save money if they all don't have to be going across the Bay Bridge at 8:30 on a weekday morning. It's something that can be embraced by liberals and conservatives alike, and it is something that works, as we see around the globe. But at the same time, by pricing congestion, we can also reorder what the charges are for other people in the system. I hear repeatedly from friends of mine, well, this doesn't work in Montana because we drive a lot. Well, if we're going to continue to have a system that is based on gallons of fuel consumed, people in Montana are going to get screwed. They tend to use more gasoline than my gas-sipping Prius drivers in Portlandia, who don't drive as much and actually don't even need a car. There can be an adjustment for the rate nationally for people who are not suffering from massive congestion. There could be a lower rate in rural and small-town America, higher rate where the congestion really is, and we can have the revenues that are necessary to be able to get into the new system and to be able to rebuild and renew what we've got. I've got to stop because I'm going to rattle on. We might get into some of this in the questions. But basically, my agenda for Congress is to guide and encourage what's largely happening in the states right now, and that there ought to be a lighter regulatory touch rather than heavier. I think it is important for us to be able to help people have perspective. Notwithstanding the last campaign, I think the truth matters. I think it's important to try and help people evaluate risks and rewards. I find it mind-numbing that there was more attention paid to one death in a Tesla than all the ink for the 10% increase in traffic fatalities. Thousands of people. People can't evaluate risk. We need to be able to help them understand what it is. It is critical that the federal government gets behind this revolution. Now, you're aware of some of the DARPA tests on the autonomous vehicles and how rapidly that improvement has taken place. Well, there's a reason that the military cares about autonomous vehicles. You know, it costs us $400 a gallon to deliver fuel in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the people driving those trucks might as well have a great big bullseye on their back. An autonomous vehicle can have the same operational application advantage for the military as drones can have. But it goes beyond the military. Let's get the post office with, I forget how many 100,000 vehicles they have, converted to electric and autonomous vehicles, and be able to be a proving ground on certain routes that they're involved with. Let's have GSA contract with Uber or Lyft in exchange for getting rid of a motor pool Why have parking, inventory, maintenance, the scheduling problems, when there's the capacity to deal with private operations that can provide the same service for less money, less capital investment, and do so more efficiently? Let's start experimenting with that. I think it is important that we focus on cyber security. Now, I don't know how many votes the Russians influenced in the last election, but I do know that there's the capacity right now for a sophisticated hacker to stop an automobile's engine, lock the doors, deploy the airbags. I mean, I was at a conference 2 years ago at Harvard, where a CEO of another unnamed large automobile manufacturer basically described the product as big computers with wheels. There will be more interrelationships, more opportunities for mischief, more opportunities for problems. We're going to need all sorts of expansion of bandwidth to be able to deal with the demands that this will bring about. We have an opportunity to redirect now employment with some of the savings and the revenues that we're able to generate. I'm serious about thinking that many of these 12 million jobs will be at risk, and we need to be deploying our resources and our energy to be able to capture those folks and be able to move them, not capture, help them redirect their energies for positions that will be involved with rebuilding and renewing the country. Those are very labor intensive. If we're going to need a fraction of the parking spaces we have now, being able to redesign the streetscape, widen the sidewalks, be able to reclaim that massive amount of urban acreage for other purposes. How many municipal parking garages in the next 10 years will be unable to service their debt payments because of a drop in utilization if we do this right? There's a lot of opportunity to repurpose them for maybe affordable housing or congregate care for geezer baby boomers. There is a really exciting possibility of reimagining what our communities are going to look like, giving people meaningful work to make these communities work better for individuals, have a better flow of transportation that is safer, and be able to have an equitable treatment for people in rural and small town America, not just for an autonomous vehicle that may be able to help them not be stranded if they can no longer afford to drive or be able to drive, but be able to balance out the equities. I think this is one of the most profound developments that we are going to be looking at for the next 20 years. It will challenge our ability to get policies right, but we have an opportunity to structure it with more carrots than sticks to make sure that the vast majority of people benefit from this and that the public is able to see communities that work better, where people are healthier, safer, and more economically secure. I appreciate Brookings convening this conversation and look forward to where Amy takes it.
Blumenauer. Champion for cities that are livable, sustainable, equitable for more citizens. And you can see that vision and energy from him this morning. So we're really lucky to have you. Ted said in his moderating that he was a techno-pessimist. I think of myself at this issue as a urban pragmatist, in the sense that a lot of these new technologies, particularly the experience between Uber and Lyft, have really come through cities. And a lot of the reforms and the regulatory frameworks and that enable these technologies and the experimentation that's going on is happening city by city, state by state, negotiating, enabling this technology to be supported and allowed. So it's been disrupting the way we live, but it's certainly disrupting a lot of the legal frameworks in many communities. And so in many respects, I think that there's literally a rubber hits the road in how this technology gets adopted. And as you said, how we prepare for this in our communities. And so I see a lot of what you're talking about is how do we prepare for this new technology and this new environment, but also probably anticipate enormous disruption and an enormous amount of adjustment to what you call a dual system of people who retain car ownership, retain that choice and privacy and convenience they want, with a lot of the other benefits of this new technology. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting time. I wanted to use my questions to just explore more deeply some of the impacts of ride sharing and autonomous vehicles on the impact on financing, which you touched about, the impact on other modes, which you raised, and go a little bit deeper on the implications on planning and the built environment. And then we'll open up the floor for many of you. So I think you're absolutely right that we are in a really urgent mode right now around how we pay for infrastructure. While we're bringing trying to incorporate this new technology into our built environment, we're also facing a public infrastructure system that is in severe state of disrepair. And we can't even finance the existing public infrastructure, let alone trying to modernize it and prepare it for the new technologies. And ironically, I think the new technologies are cannibalizing the very revenues that could support that public infrastructure. And so you talk a lot about the Portland experiment. You talked a little bit about congestion pricing, but tell us more. How do we realistically support the need to modernize our public infrastructure system and also prepare for this new technology with financing? Do you see some reforms happening city by city, state by state that we can learn from?
Well, certainly there's a great deal of activity at the local level. We had, I think it was 37 initiatives that were approved at the ballot box in November, totaling about $200 billion. Local voters are willing to be supportive if they see that there are results in the offing that they understand and they're comfortable with it. I referenced 8 Republican legislatures, one of them was Democratic with a Republican governor, that raised the gas tax this year. There is the capacity to do this. There's a willingness to do it if people feel comfortable about the results. And I mean, what I said, that I think we ought to make sure that we share the benefits and that we're able to make clear what it is that is actually happening. I think key to this is to be able to have a more equitable and sustainable financing system and let people understand what the benefits will be for rural and small town America, as well as the big cities that have some of the most serious congestion problems. Rather than run away from congestion pricing, I think we ought to face it head on, because the alternative is going to be a complete collapse of the transportation infrastructure funding model. And I think it's time for maybe a little bit of courage. We have an administration that wants to spend, incoming administration that wants to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, which is a good start. But congestion pricing does not have to be ideological. It is something that libertarian friends can, our friends who are economists, people who are pragmatists. I think by being honest and direct and being able to tie it to these jobs for rebuilding and renewing America. We could create several million family wage jobs in a matter of months if we were able to undertake this. And there is a laundry list in every community, not just surface transportation, but water and sewer. There are opportunities to put people to work in tangible ways, and many of these projects can be self-financed if there is, if we can give a people assurance that they're going to get the benefit of the investment.
And let me talk about, ask you about your vision of a multimodal system, I guess, with autonomous vehicles. And because you've been a big champion of it. You've been, I think you bike to work almost every day now, have been for many years. You're a big champion of transit. But I also see an era where if driving becomes easier, more convenient, allows you, it gives back your time, right? That all the incentives that once drove people to walk and bike and take a transit has been removed. Because now I can get into a self-driving vehicle, I can get my work done, I can, the tolerance for congestion is a little bit easier. Do you see autonomous vehicle fitting with other modes? Do you see it over time actually reducing demand for other forms of transportation?
Well, I made a reference that we sort of backed into the automobile century. Yeah. We didn't really carefully think through the impact that what happened in Detroit in terms of all this massive highway construction, tearing up neighborhoods, isolating people, and not giving choices for those who didn't want to drive, couldn't afford to drive. What I see happening is the autonomous vehicle fitting into a mixture of choices. It'll give people more choice. If somebody wants to drive to work every day, so be it. But they ought to pay for it. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be subsidized by everybody. I want to end socialism for the car. Let me just say that. I think that what we're seeing with younger people, when they are given choices, a lot of them, the majority still ultimately get their driver's licenses, but they are much less enamored of owning their own car. They know how to get access to car share or car to go, Uber, Lyft. They manipulate it into in many instances a seamless system. They know how to get from point A to point B based on the experience they want and the costs. What I envision happening here is that we develop with a nationwide road user charge, we have a technological framework that can enable us with our smartphone to drive if we want and pay tolls, to pay for parking, find out where the closest parking space is, to hop on Metro or bike share or Amtrak, so that we'll be giving people more choices. I think there will always be some who will, you have to pry their fingers, their cold, dead fingers off the steering wheel. But a lot of people are making choices right now to have fewer cars or no car for what's right for them. And in a country that's going to have another 100 million people by mid-century, being able to refine those choices, make them easy, transparent, and be able to even out the costs and subsidies, I think is going to go a long way towards empowering people to do what's right for them. And if they want to drive, so be it. But I think everybody ought to have choices, and the funding ought to be equitable.
It's interesting. I always think about how, folks talk about how young folks prefer to live in the city. They might prefer to use Uber, but everyone goes through a life cycle. And the moment that young person has a child has 2 strollers, has all the bags, and you start to take your family trips, intercity travel. We think about Uber as really short trips, but intercity travel to see your in-laws. People don't want that moving storage, as you talked about. So I do think that having a system that is going to realistically support, all these different lifestyle phases.
But I honestly think we're reaching a point where we may be able to have a more robust, reasonable set of challenges. I recently took my 2 grandsons, one just 4, one almost 4. We flew to Seattle, a short little trip, and they had their window seats, and it was quite exciting. And then we took light rail to Seattle Center. We took monorail to the Space Needle. I would have liked to have been able to do that on Amtrak. I am hopeful that America gets to the point where we have a range of choices like most other civilized countries have, and then people can choose what makes most sense for them. If they want to be trapped in the car with 2 4-year-olds, or they want them to walk the aisles, or, let's give people reasonable choices that actually enhance quality of life and economic opportunities.
Let's talk about the built environment, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. You've used the word let's be more intentional. Tell me what it means to be more intentional about how to physically plan our communities to incorporate now more self-driving technologies. What do we see in the future in the built environment? Well,
I think we are looking at a revolution in thinking about how we use urban space. Detroit is an example in terms of what's happening there. I would think that what we need to do for autonomous vehicles is the same thing we ought to do for people. We ought to minimize where we can hard infrastructure. We ought to be able to have multiple benefits of it. See, I think there are other reasons that people want to walk or bike than just necessity. It is a much healthier alternative to be able to stroll to make that purchase. It's the social interaction, the exercise of cycling, watching the community at 15 kilometers an hour. I think when we are going to make sure that we take advantage of the reduced demand for parking, which I think will be revolutionary, that we're able to soften the landscape. We can make greener cities. It helps us deal with heat islands. It helps us deal with stormwater runoff. We tend to get more rain when we don't want it. It's not there when we do. But to be able to take an urban environment that is more pleasant, that is more functional, that is more sustainable, that will enable autonomous vehicles to be able, along with the platforms for things like Uber and Lyft, that they'll have a place that works for them, but it is not dominated, as it is today in too many cities, by single occupant vehicles that have to be tended, parked, and accommodated on an ongoing basis at great expense and damage to the environment.
There's on this point, there are articles that are saying that autonomous vehicles will enable sprawl, that it will enable folks to now live further distances and not, again, incur the costs of the long commute as before. What's your thoughts on that?
But that's why, Amy, that this should be intentional. Mm-hmm. Every region should have thoughtful land use planning. Mm-hmm. We ought to be able to have the housing types that people want that's well-designed, convenient, and affordable, that we protect farm and forest land. There are other values at work here. And maybe I'm biased. I come from a state where every square inch is zoned, planned, and mapped. But we've been able to protect farmland. We've been able to maintain urban growth boundaries. We've been able to revitalize interurban neighborhoods, and people can still raise families and make a living. I think when we look at what's going on in places like Houston now that are rediscovering some of these principles, I think we're going to see more people moving towards thoughtful planning rather than just mindless sprawl, problems with utility costs, water availability, and extending roadways.
And so what you're saying is with AV, their technology, it doesn't remove the values that we've been all talking about for a long time in our communities.
It'll enable more people to benefit from them, I think.
That's great. I think we have time for one question.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. But a nice hand up right there in the back. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Malcolm Kenton. I'm a freelance writer. So there's many who say that the driverless cars are imminent, like within the next 10 years there'll be widespread adoption, particularly in metro areas, and there are some who say it's maybe 30, 40 years if they even become widespread adopted. So how should policymakers and others interested in this, what sort of time frame should we be operating under given the wide disagreements amongst people who are considering the subject on how imminent the
best way to
is?
resolve it is by letting people try it. And I think we ought to be encouraging experiments. Maybe if Las Vegas wants to take a large section of the strip, dedicate it to low-speed autonomous vehicles, let them go. What's going on in Pittsburgh or San Francisco, other communities can and should be encouraged to find applications that make sense. I personally believe you're going to see much more rapid adoption. I think there's going to be changes, like I mentioned, in terms of the trucking industry, just like we're seeing dealing with personal vehicles, cabs, that are going to accelerate quickly if we allow it. I think we need to be careful about the terms under which it is conducted. I think we need to be mindful about how people are treated who work in this environment, both in terms of those who will drive or those who are competing with things like Uber and Lyft. But I think these are issues that we can reconcile and that we can work through. And some cities are doing this now with some of the organizations like Lyft and Uber. But let's allow this to happen. Let's have some rural experiments to find out how we can change the lives of people who are trapped if they can't drive a vehicle, but who may want to stay in Lame Deer, Wyoming, and still get to the doctor or the post office. I think the more we encourage with a gentle regulatory hand and be mindful of costs and consequences, I think the better off we will be. And I think the spirit in Washington, D.C. over the next couple of years should be something that will encourage these 1,000 flowers to blossom so that we can learn from that experience, and then we can do the minimum that we need for safety, security, and for the financing mechanism.
I'm going to take my moderator prerogative and ask you one question, final question, give you 30 seconds to answer, which is, what is your estimation about a major infrastructure bill happening in the next Congress and the new Trump administration? Will it be in the first 100 days?
I don't think there will be a major infrastructure bill. I think there is a chance to do some major infrastructure finance, but there, as you know, are fiercely differing opinions about exactly who benefits and how much of it should be real money for real projects as opposed to simply tax credits for some projects that may already being built. If we can resolve that, I think the odds are very good. But I think the trends that we've discussed here this morning make it very likely that the next reauthorization in 5 years is fundamentally different and very exciting.
That is great. Please join me in thanking Congressman Blumenauer for joining us this afternoon. And thank you for spending this morning with us. Have a great day.